Major Greg Feast was 15 seconds from the release point when he finally saw the building. He was flying alone. He had no radar. He had no jamming pod. He had no wingman, no escort, no fighter cover, and no way to run. His aircraft could not go supersonic. It could not climb away from trouble. It carried 2 bombs and nothing else, and its only defense was a shape. The target was an Iraqi interceptor operations center at Nukaib, out in the western desert, roughly 150 miles inside enemy territory. It was the nerve ending of a national air defense network, the place where radar pictures became orders, and orders became missiles. If it lived, the aircraft coming behind him would fly into a system that could see them. In 15 seconds, he would have to open his bomb bay doors. That was the part nobody outside the program talked about. For those few seconds, while the doors swung down into the airflow, the aircraft that almost nothing could see would become an aircraft that anything could see. Flat panels would give way to open cavities. The careful geometry would break. The bomb bay was, for a handful of heartbeats, a hole in the magic. It was about 2:51 in the morning on January 17th, 1991. The war had not started yet. Feast did not know that cruise missiles were already in the air. He knew only that in a few seconds he was going to open the doors, drop a weapon, and find out whether 30 years of Soviet radar engineering had a flaw in it. Before we go any further, I need to ask you something small. Cold War Impact is a small channel covering Cold War and military history, and our reach has been falling. If you value carefully researched history, please subscribe, leave a comment, and share this video. Every single interaction helps this channel reach new people, and it is the only reason these long-form documentaries keep getting made. Now, back to the desert. 36 of these aircraft went to war that night. They made up roughly 2.5% of the coalition aircraft flying in the opening hours. They struck about 31% of the strategic targets hit on the first night of the air campaign. Over the whole campaign, they flew more than 1,200 sorties into the most heavily defended airspace on the planet. Baghdad in 1991 was ringed by dozens of surface-to-air missile batteries and covered by thousands of anti-aircraft guns. It was wired together by a command network built specifically to stop exactly this kind of attack. Not one of those aircraft was shot down. Not one was hit. The weapon that made that possible was not a new missile. It was not a jamming aircraft. It was not speed, and it was not altitude. Every one of those things had already been tried against Soviet air defenses, and every one of them had failed. The weapon was a book. 243 pages of mathematics, published in Moscow in 1962 by a Soviet physicist and released to the world because a committee in the Soviet Union decided it had no military value whatsoever. To understand how a Soviet textbook ended up hiding an American bomber over Baghdad, we have to go back 31 years to a Sunday morning over the Ural Mountains when the United States discovered that the sky was no longer a safe place to hide. The Central Intelligence Agency called the U-2 the answer to an impossible problem. It flew at around 70,000 feet. Soviet fighters could not reach it. Soviet guns could not touch it. Soviet radar could see it, and that was maddening for Moscow, but seeing something and killing it are two entirely different problems. And for 4 years, the Soviet Union could do the first and not the second. The entire doctrine of the U-2 rested on that gap. Fly high enough, and altitude is armor. On May 1, 1960, Francis Gary Powers took off from Peshawar in Pakistan. His route ran deep across the Soviet Union, past Sverdlovsk and Plesetsk, and out to Bodo in Norway. It was the most ambitious overflight yet attempted, nearly 3,000 miles of Soviet territory. Near Sverdlovsk, the sky stopped being safe. Soviet air defense batteries fired a salvo of S-75 missiles. Accounts of how many differ sharply. Some sources say 8. Others, including the National Museum of the United States Air Force, put the figure at 14. What is not disputed is what the salvo did. It was uncoordinated. It was frantic. Multiple battalions fired at a confused radar picture without properly deconflicting with their own aircraft. One missile detonated close enough to the U-2 to tear it apart. Powers survived, was captured, and was later exchanged on a bridge in Berlin. And in the same engagement, another missile from the same salvo destroyed a Soviet MiG-19. Its pilot, Senior Lieutenant Sergei Safronov, was killed by his own side. That detail matters more than the spy story, and it is almost always left out. The system that ended American high-altitude invulnerability was crude. It was badly coordinated. It killed one of its own men in the process of getting its kill, and it worked anyway. That is the lesson the Soviet Union learned on May 1, 1960, and the lesson the United States refused to learn for another 13 years. A surface-to-air missile does not have to be elegant. It only has to be in the sky at roughly the same place as the aircraft. 2 years later, in October 1962, the same missile did it again, and this time a man did not come home. Major Rudolf Anderson Jr. of the United States Air Force flew his 6th reconnaissance mission over Cuba on October 27, 1962, the day the crisis came closest to war. Over Baines at around 72,000 feet, a Soviet battery fired without authorization from Moscow. The warhead did not need a direct hit. Fragments punctured his pressure suit at an altitude where the human body cannot survive without one. Anderson was the only combat death of the Cuban Missile Crisis. He received the first Air Force Cross ever awarded. 2 aircraft. 2 of the most sophisticated machines in the world. Both killed by the same Soviet missile system, guided by the same family of radars. And that system was about to be exported to almost everyone the Soviet Union liked. The S-75 went to North Vietnam. So did the radars, the training, the doctrine, and the Soviet advisors who understood how the pieces fit. What American aircrews met over North Vietnam was not a collection of individual weapons. It was a network. Long-range radars searched, height finders measured, fire control radars locked, missiles launched. Guns filled the gaps below the missiles, and fighters worked the gaps above them. Everything was tied together by wire and by procedure, and the whole thing was designed to make sure that if you evaded one layer, you flew directly into the next. The United States built an entirely new mission to fight it. The wild weasels flew straight at the missile sites, deliberately inviting the radar to lock on, and then fired missiles that rode the radar beam back to its source. It was the most nakedly courageous flying of the war, and it was still an admission of defeat. The weasels did not defeat the radar network. They persuaded it to switch off for a few minutes at a time. Then came December 1972, and the clearest demonstration the Cold War ever produced of what a mature Soviet air defense network could do to a modern air force. Linebacker II ran from December 18th to December 29th, 1972. Strategic Air Command flew 729 B-52 sorties and dropped about 15,000 tons of bombs. North Vietnamese batteries fired roughly 1,240 surface-to-air missiles at them. The official Air Force figure is 15 B-52s lost. Other accounts, counting aircraft written off after they limped home, put the number higher. North Vietnam claimed more than double the official total. The loss rate, measured against total sorties, was under 2%, and on paper that sounds survivable. It did not feel survivable to the crews, and the reason why is the single most important tactical lesson in this entire story. On the first nights, the bombers came in on the same routes, at the same altitudes, in the same formations, and executed the same steep turn after releasing their bombs. That turn was in the manual. It was supposed to get them out of the target area quickly. What it actually did was swing the aircraft belly first into the missiles, point the jamming antennas away from the radars they were supposed to be jamming, and slow the bomber down against a powerful headwind at exactly the moment it was most exposed. The North Vietnamese operators worked this out within 2 nights. They did not need better missiles. They needed only to know where the American aircraft would be. And the American aircraft told them night after night by doing the same thing. Remember that. Predictability killed those crews. It is going to come back 27 years later over a field in Serbia, and it is going to kill something that was supposed to be unkillable. But the moment that truly created stealth did not happen to the Americans at all. It happened to the Israelis, and it took 3 days. In October 1973, Egypt and Syria attacked Israel. The Israeli Air Force was, by any measure, one of the finest in the world. Its pilots had shattered 3 Arab air forces on the ground in 1967. It expected to do something similar again. Instead, it flew into a wall. Egypt had built a dense belt of Soviet-supplied air defenses along the Suez Canal. Roughly 20 batteries of the mobile SA-6, backed by dozens of older SA-2 and SA-3 batteries, thousands of shoulder-fired missiles, and radar-directed anti-aircraft guns. Syria fielded a similar belt in the north. The SA-6 was the shock. It was mobile, so it could not be reliably mapped in advance. It used guidance frequencies the Israelis had not prepared for, and it sat at the exact altitude band that pilots dived into when they were trying to escape the older missiles. The result was a trap with no floor. Climb and the missiles took you. Dive and the guns took you. Stay level and both took you. In the first 3 days of the war, the Israeli Air Force lost around 50 aircraft. Totals differ between sources, and they always will, but the loss rate across those opening days sat somewhere near 4% of every sortie flown. By the end of the first week, the figure had climbed to roughly 80 aircraft. The missiles and the radar-guided guns fell hardest on the Skyhawks and the Phantoms, the backbone of the strike force. 4% does not sound like a catastrophe until you do the arithmetic on it. At 4% per sortie, an Air Force flying at wartime tempo does not last weeks. That is precisely the arithmetic that American planners did in the winter of 1973, and it terrified them. The systems that had just gutted the Israeli Air Force in 3 days were the export versions. The Warsaw Pact kept the better ones. American analysts concluded that in a full-scale war in Central Europe at those loss rates, NATO tactical air power would be consumed in something like 2 weeks. Not defeated. Consumed. Used up like ammunition. Every solution on the table was a variation of the same idea. Fly lower, fly faster, jam harder, fire more anti-radiation missiles, send more aircraft and accept the losses. Every one of them was an attempt to survive the radar. Nobody in the Pentagon was working on the possibility of simply not being seen by it, because nobody believed that was physically possible, and the answer had already been printed, bound, and put on sale in Moscow. Anyone could buy it. Almost nobody had read it. To understand why the Soviet Union gave away the key to its own front door, you have to understand the men who built the lock and the single assumption they never questioned. Alexander Andreevich Rasputin was not a fanatic. He was an engineer, and by every account a formidable one. He rose through Soviet radio engineering during the war, and by the 1950s he was the chief designer at the design bureau that would build the Soviet Union's air defense missiles. His first great work was a ring of missile sites around Moscow, built to stop American bombers carrying nuclear weapons. It was enormous, expensive, and fixed in place. Then he built the thing that changed the world, the S-75, a transportable missile system that could be sent anywhere and set up in hours. The missile itself was designed by Pyotr Grushin, who ran a separate bureau and who was, in his own way, just as important. Grushin's missiles did not need to be accurate in the way a rifle is accurate. They needed to get close, and then a proximity fuse and a fragmentation warhead did the rest. But the missile was never the hard part. The hard part was always the radar. Understand how the Soviet system actually worked, because everything that follows depends on it. The network used 2 very different kinds of radar, doing 2 very different jobs. The first kind searched. These were the early warning sets, machines like the P-12 and later the P-18, and they worked down in the very high frequency band at roughly 150 to 170 megahertz. Their radio waves were about 2 meters long. A wave that long is clumsy. It cannot tell you precisely where something is. What it can do is travel a very long way and bounce off almost anything. The second kind aimed. These were the fire control radars, the ones the missiles actually needed, and they worked at much higher frequencies with wavelengths measured in centimeters. Shortwaves give you precision. They let you tell a missile not just that an aircraft exists, but exactly where it is, right now, and where it will be in 9 seconds. Neither radar could kill anything on its own. The long-wave set could see you, but not shoot you. The shortwave set could shoot you, but could not find you on its own across a whole country. Together they were lethal. The long-wave radar found the aircraft and told the battery roughly where to look. The battery pointed its shortwave radar at that patch of sky, locked on, and fired. Search, then aim. That division of labor was the beating heart of Soviet air defense doctrine. Hold on to it. It is going to decide this story twice, once in 1991 and once in 1999, and it is going to give opposite answers both times. The entire architecture rested on one assumption, and Rasputin never had any reason to question it because in 1955, no human being had ever seen an exception. The assumption was this: anything large enough to carry a bomb is large enough to be seen. It seemed less like an assumption than like a law of nature. A bomber is a piece of metal the size of a house. Radio waves bounce off metal. Make the aircraft bigger, and the echo grows. Make it smaller, and you cannot carry a weapon far enough to matter. Every Soviet radar, every Soviet missile, every Soviet air defense manual, and every Soviet officer's training was built on top of that assumption. The Soviet Union then spent 3 decades and an almost unimaginable share of its national wealth building the largest air defense network in the history of the world on that foundation. And while they were building it, 6 years after powers came down over Sverdlovsk, a physicist in Moscow published a book explaining in complete mathematical detail exactly why the assumption was wrong. His name was Pyotr Yakovlevich Ufimtsev. He was born in 1931 in the Altai region of Siberia. He was not a weapons designer. He was not an aircraft engineer. He was a theoretical physicist working on diffraction, which is the study of how waves bend and scatter when they meet an edge. His book was called Method of Edge Waves in the Physical Theory of Diffraction. It was published in Moscow in 1962 by the State Technical Press. Some sources give the date as 1964. It ran to 243 pages, and it was, by any normal standard, unreadable. It was pure mathematics from the first page to the last. What it said underneath the equations was this: the amount of energy a radar gets back from an object depends far less on how big that object is than on the shape and the orientation of its edges and its surfaces. An echo is not really a reflection of a mass. It is the sum of many small scatterings from edges, corners, curves, and joints. And crucially, Ufimtsev provided a method to calculate that sum precisely for a body made of flat panels before the body was ever built. He was building on earlier work, including Joseph Keller's theory of how waves behave at edges, which was itself built on physics reaching back to the 19th century. Ufimtsev did not invent electromagnetism, and it is a serious overstatement to say he invented stealth. What he did was far more specific and far more dangerous. He made the radar return of an object computable in advance. If you can calculate the echo of a shape before you build it, then you can search for a shape whose echo is almost nothing. You can, in principle, design a large aircraft that returns less energy than a small bird. Ufimtsev submitted his work for review, as every Soviet scientist had to. The state examined it for military sensitivity. The reviewers concluded that the work had no significant military or economic value, and he was granted permission to publish it openly, internationally, without restriction. They were not stupid. They were, in the strictest sense, right about their own country. Nobody in the Soviet Union could build the aircraft Ufimtsev's mathematics described, and the reason has nothing to do with physics. A shape designed purely to defeat radar is a shape designed with no regard whatsoever for flying. It is aerodynamically unstable in every axis. It will not stay in the air. The only way to fly it is to put a computer between the pilot and the control surfaces, a computer fast enough to make corrections many times per second, forever, for the entire duration of the flight. In 1962, that computer did not exist anywhere on Earth. So Ufimtsev's book was, at the moment of its publication, a genuinely useless piece of mathematics. The Soviet Review Board looked at a set of equations describing an aircraft nobody could fly and made an entirely reasonable decision. They just made it about 10 years too early. In 1971, the Foreign Technology Division of the United States Air Force at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio translated Ufimtsev's book into English as part of a routine program of translating open Soviet scientific literature. There was nothing dramatic about it. There was no theft, no defection, no spy. The Soviet Union had published the book, and the United States government translated it, catalogued it, and shelved it in a technical library, where it sat for years while the Israeli Air Force was being taken apart over Suez. Denys Overholser was a radar specialist and mathematician at the Lockheed Skunk Works, the secretive advanced projects division that had built the U-2 and the Blackbird. In the mid-1970s, he was looking for a way to predict radar returns from complex shapes, and he found the translation. Ben Rich, who ran the Skunk Works, would later describe what Overholser brought him as the Rosetta Stone of stealth technology. Rich was blunter about the source material itself. He wrote in his memoir that the paper was so obtuse and impenetrable that only a nerd's nerd would ever have waded through it, and he meant it as the highest compliment he knew how to pay. Overholser worked with Bill Schroeder, a retired Lockheed mathematician who came back to help, and together they turned Ufimtsev's equations into a computer program. They called it Echo 1. Feed it a shape, and it would predict how visible that shape was to radar. And here is where the story turns, because Echo 1 had a crippling limitation, and that limitation is the reason the first stealth aircraft looks the way it looks. The computers of the middle 1970s could not solve Ufimtsev's equations for curved surfaces. The mathematics was there, the processing power was not. The only shapes Echo 1 could calculate accurately were flat panels joined at sharp angles, so the aircraft had to be made of flat panels joined at sharp angles. That is the entire explanation for the strangest looking combat aircraft ever built. It is not a stylistic choice. It is not aerodynamics. It is not an attempt to look menacing. The F-117 looks like a crystal because in 1975, that was the only kind of shape a computer could check. The design that came out of Echo 1 was so aggressively ugly that the engineers named it the Hopeless Diamond, after the Hope Diamond, and after their own expectations of it. Kelly Johnson, the legendary Lockheed designer who had built the Blackbird, is said in Ben Rich's memoir to have looked at it and remarked that an old Lockheed drone had a smaller radar signature than that thing. He was wrong, and the proof came on a pole in the New Mexico desert. In early 1976, at the Radar Target Measurement Range at White Sands, Lockheed and Northrop both mounted full-scale models of their proposed designs on tall poles and lit them up with radar. Lockheed's model was so quiet that the technicians initially assumed something had gone wrong with the test. The dominant echo they were measuring was not coming from the aircraft. It was coming from the pole holding it up. They had to build a new pole. Lockheed spent close to $200,000 designing a mount that was itself nearly invisible to radar, simply so that the model could be measured at all. The models were also absurdly sensitive to contamination. A smudge, a loose screw head, a misaligned panel, and the signature jumped. Range technicians spent hours cleaning surfaces. There is a well-worn story in the stealth community that on one occasion a bird landed on a test model and the radar return bloomed instantly. It has been told many times and it perfectly captures the physics, though it should be treated as an illustration rather than a precisely documented event. In April 1976, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency chose Lockheed. Northrop's design, which used blended curves rather than flat facets, was excellent from some angles and far too visible from others. Lockheed had won the right to build 2 aircraft and both of them were going to be destroyed. The program was called Have Blue. 2 demonstrators were built in secret, using whatever could be scavenged to save time and money. The flight control computers came from the F-16. The main landing gear came from the A-10. The ejection seat and much of the cockpit instrumentation came from the F-5. They were small, roughly the size of a trainer, and they were never intended to carry a weapon. The first aircraft, HB-1001, flew on December 1, 1977 at the remote test site at Groom Lake in Nevada. The pilot was Bill Park, a Lockheed test pilot with the kind of career that gets written about after the classification expires. The second aircraft was flown by Ken Dyson, an Air Force officer. Between them, those 2 men were the only human beings who ever flew a Have Blue. The aircraft worked. The radar measurements were extraordinary. The Air Force went ahead with a real combat aircraft on the strength of what these 2 machines demonstrated. And then, on May 4, 1978, Bill Park brought HB-1001 in to land, and the aircraft came down hard. The impact jammed the landing gear partway up. Park applied power and went around, climbing to try to shake the gear free. He could not. He kept trying. And while he was trying, the fuel ran out. He ejected. The seat worked, but something in the sequence knocked him unconscious, and he came down without being able to control his landing. He survived, seriously injured with damage that ended his career. Bill Park never flew a test flight again. The second aircraft flew for another year. On July 11, 1979, on its 52nd flight, a hydraulic line failed. Hot exhaust gas had been leaking into the engine compartment through a loosened clamp, and it started a fire. The fire destroyed the hydraulics. Without hydraulics, the flight control computers could not move the control surfaces, and without the flight control computers, the aircraft was not an aircraft. It was a falling wedge of metal. Ken Dyson ejected. He got out cleanly. 2 aircraft built, 2 aircraft destroyed. neither ever carried a bomb. Neither was ever photographed by the public. One test pilot's career was over. The entire program had, at the end of it, nothing physical to show at all. What it had was data. And the data said that the assumption Alexander Raspletin had built the Soviet air defense network on was false. The operational aircraft was called Senior Trend, and it first flew on June 18, 1981 at Groom Lake, with Lockheed test pilot Hal Farley at the controls. Farley was appropriately given the pilot identification number 117, and the aircraft that emerged from the program would be known to the world as the F-117. Nobody has ever fully explained that designation, and that is not a gap in the research. It is a genuine mystery. The Air Force had since 1962 numbered its fighters in a simple sequence. The number after the F-20 should have been F-21 or perhaps F-19, which had been skipped. It certainly should not have been 117. One theory is that Soviet aircraft flown secretly in Nevada for training purposes carried numbers in a similar range, and the stealth aircraft was quietly slotted into that sequence. Another is that the number simply appeared on Lockheed paperwork, and the Air Force saw no reason to correct it, and that the confusion it caused was useful in itself. A third holds that it was called a fighter rather than an attack aircraft, purely because the Air Force wanted its best pilots to volunteer, and the best pilots wanted to fly fighters. Whatever the truth, the F-117 was not a fighter. It had no radar. It carried no air-to-air missiles. It could not have won a dogfight against a 1940 vintage trainer. It was a bomber, and a slow one, and the letter on the side of it was a lie that no one ever bothered to correct. The aircraft went to Tonopah Test Range in Nevada to a unit called the 4450th Tactical Group, and there it disappeared for 7 years. It flew only at night. Every flight, every training sortie, every check ride in darkness. During the day, the aircraft sat in individual climate-controlled hangars behind a level of security that was extreme even by the standards of the era. The cover story was a squadron of A-7 Corsairs based at Tonopah, ostensibly for a test program. They were real aircraft, and they were genuinely flown both as chase planes and to keep the stealth pilots current on night flying without revealing what they were actually current in. Anyone watching the base saw Corsairs and drew the obvious conclusion. The pilots lived in Las Vegas with their families and commuted to Tonopah on unmarked contractor airliners at the start of each week, and home again at the end of it. Their wives and children did not know what they flew. Many of them believed for years that their husbands and fathers were doing something routine. 2 of those men did not come home. Major Ross Mulhare was killed on July 11, 1986, when his aircraft flew into terrain at night near Bakersfield, California. He made no apparent attempt to eject. Major Michael Stewart was killed on October 14, 1987, in a crash on a range in Nevada. Both crashes were followed by immediate and total security cordons. Both were surrounded by cover stories. The families of both men were told, essentially, nothing. Their husbands had died flying an aircraft that officially did not exist, in a program that could not be discussed, for a reason that could not be explained. That is the price of the thing. It is easy to talk about stealth as a triumph of engineering, and it was. It was also 7 years in which 2 officers died in secret, and their families were handed a folded flag and a wall of silence. On November 10, 1988, the Pentagon finally admitted the aircraft existed. The announcement consisted of a short statement and a single photograph, deliberately grainy and shot at an angle that revealed as little as possible about the aircraft's true geometry. The world's aviation press had been speculating about a secret stealth fighter for years. They had drawn it wrong. Nobody had imagined anything that looked like that. And 13 months later, on its combat debut, it failed. Operation Just Cause began on December 20, 1989 in Panama. 2 F-117s were assigned to support an airborne assault on the Rio Hato barracks. Their orders were unusual. They were not supposed to hit the barracks. They were supposed to drop 2,000-pound bombs into open ground nearby, close enough to stun and disorient the defenders, but not close enough to kill large numbers of them so that American Rangers could jump onto the airfield against a shaken enemy. Almost nothing about it went right. The wind shifted at the last moment. Communications about the change were confused. The infrared targeting system, which had been refined over the dry, sharply contrasted terrain of the Nevada desert, performed poorly in the hot, humid, vegetated air of Panama. The lead pilot dropped in a position that had been intended for the second aircraft, and the second pilot, keying off the first explosion, dropped further from his aim point than planned. The bombs landed. Nobody could agree how far off they were, and that in itself is the most revealing detail of the whole affair. Senior officers gave different accounts of where the bombs were even supposed to land. One general said 165 yards from the barracks. Another believed the figure was 275 yards. The Air Force said around 55 yards. These are not small discrepancies. In Washington, the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee tore into the whole thing, dismissing the use of the aircraft as show business and suggesting that the Air Force had flown it to Panama mainly to justify its budget. He noted acidly that the United States had plenty of aircraft capable of missing a building. It was a fair hit. The most expensive attack aircraft in the world had been sent to war for the first time and had produced a public argument about whether it had hit the ground where it meant to. 14 months later, the same aircraft would be sent against the densest air defense network on Earth. And this time, there would be no argument at all. Before we get to that night, you need to understand precisely what stealth does, because almost everything popular culture says about it is wrong. Stealth does not make an aircraft invisible. It does not absorb all radar energy. It does not bend light. It does not create a hole in space. What it does is shrink the distance at which a radar can detect you. Every radar has a threshold. It must receive back some minimum amount of energy before it can distinguish an aircraft from the background noise of the sky, from birds, from weather, from the ground clutter beneath. Detection range depends on how much energy comes back. Cut the returned energy dramatically, and the radar can still see you, but only when you are extremely close. Close enough that by the time the operator understands what he is looking at, you have already dropped your bomb and left. The published figure for the F-117's radar signature is around 1,000th of a square meter. The real number is still classified and probably always will be. What matters is the ratio. A conventional strike aircraft of the era might return a signature thousands of times larger, but stealth in 1991 came with a list of conditions, and every single one of them was a way to lose it. The aircraft had to fly at night because the shaping did nothing at all against a pair of human eyes. It had to stay subsonic because a sonic boom announces your position to an entire province. It could not use a radar of its own because switching on a transmitter is the loudest thing an aircraft can do. So it navigated by inertial systems and found its targets with infrared cameras, looking at the world in heat rather than in radio. Its surfaces had to be nearly perfect. Every panel gap, every fastener, every scratch in the radar-absorbing coating created an edge, and edges are precisely what Ufimtsev's mathematics said would give you away. Maintenance crews spent extraordinary amounts of time on the skin of these aircraft, and it had to keep its bomb bay doors closed. Open doors break the shape. They expose a cavity, and a cavity is one of the most efficient radar reflectors that exists. For the seconds in which the doors were open, the aircraft's signature climbed sharply. Every F-117 pilot who ever went to war had to accept that at the single most important moment of the mission, over the target, at the release point with the weapon leaving the aircraft, he would briefly become visible. That is the deal. Stealth is not immunity. It is a very short window of exposure, purchased with an enormous amount of discipline. And on the night of January 17, 1991, 36 pilots flew that deal into the most concentrated air defense network built since the Cold War began. Iraq had spent the 1980s buying air defense from everyone who would sell. The command and control system, called CARI, was French-built. The radars and the missiles were overwhelmingly Soviet. The doctrine was Soviet. The architecture was a direct descendant of the network that had shredded the Israeli Air Force in 1973, and the Iraqis had studied that war closely. Baghdad alone was defended by dozens of surface-to-air missile batteries and thousands of anti-aircraft guns. American assessments described its defences as orders of magnitude heavier than anything that had ever protected Hanoi, and denser than the air defences around most Eastern European cities. And a great many of those guns did not need radar at all. They could simply be fired upward, filling a volume of sky with metal and hope. American planners were not confident. Pre-war estimates of coalition aircraft losses ran high. Several senior officers expected to lose stealth aircraft on the first night, and some expected to lose a lot of them. The attack opened at around 2:38 in the morning when American Army Apache helicopters, guided to their targets by Air Force Pave-Low helicopters, destroyed 2 Iraqi early warning radar sites near the Saudi border. That strike blew a corridor in the radar fence for the conventional aircraft coming behind. The F-117s did not use the corridor. They went in over the middle through radar coverage that was fully intact and fully alert, and they did it before the main suppression campaign began. When Greg Feast opened his bomb bay doors at around 2:51 in the morning, the Iraqi radar network was not jammed, not blinded, and not degraded. It was working exactly as designed. His bomb went into the Interceptor Operations Center. It was the first bomb dropped from an aircraft in the Gulf War, though not the first shot of it. Feast has said that in the last seconds before release, the thought that went through his mind was a question about whether they really wanted him to do this, whether he was really about to start a war. He did not know that cruise missiles were already inbound. The building died. Minutes later, other aircraft in the same package were over Baghdad itself, the telephone exchange that carried the Air Defense Network's own communications. Hit. The Air Defense Operations Center for the sector. Hit. The headquarters buildings, the command bunkers, the hardened facilities that no conventional aircraft could have reached without a package of 30 supporting aircraft and a real chance of losses. Hit, hit, and hit. And then the sky over Baghdad lit up, and the world watched it live on television. The anti-aircraft guns opened fire in a barrage that filled the sky over the city. Tracer rounds climbed in curtains. Missiles left their rails and flew, unguided, into nothing. Journalists broadcasting from a hotel described an air raid that looked like the end of the world. The Iraqis were shooting at the noise. They were shooting at the explosions. They were shooting at where they guessed something might be, in the way a man swings at a wasp in a dark room. They hit nothing. 36 aircraft, roughly 2.5% of the coalition air forces flying that night. About 31% of the strategic targets struck. 0 losses. Every one of those pilots opened his bomb bay doors over the target. Every one of them accepted those seconds of exposure above a city firing everything it had. And the network that Alexander Rasputin's successors had built, the network designed to find an aircraft and then hand it to a missile, could not close the gap between the two. It could not search and then aim. The campaign ran for 43 days. F-117s flew more than 1,200 sorties. They struck hardened aircraft shelters, command bunkers, weapons facilities, and the bridges over the Tigris and the Euphrates, hitting the large majority of the bridges they were assigned. They flew into central Baghdad repeatedly, on nights when no other manned aircraft in the coalition was permitted over the city at all. None of them was shot down. None of them was hit. But this is a history channel, not a recruiting film. And the honest version of this story includes 2 things that the celebration usually leaves out. The first is that the marketing outran the evidence. In 1997, the Government Accountability Office reviewed the claims that the Air Force and the manufacturers had made about the air campaign and found them substantially overstated. The widely quoted claim that around 80% of stealth-delivered bombs hit their targets could not be verified. About 1/3 of the reported hits had no corroborating evidence at all. When the auditors worked through the mission data properly, the probability that a given planned target was actually struck as intended came out somewhere between 41 and 60%. The F-117 was genuinely revolutionary. It was not magic. It missed. It aborted. It got weathered out. Laser-guided bombs do not work well through cloud, and Iraq in January is not always clear. The distance between what stealth actually achieved and what the press releases claimed it achieved is a real thing, and pretending otherwise is how you end up believing the next set of press releases. The second is Amiraya. On February 13, 1991, 2 F-117s struck a hardened facility in the Amiriyah district of Baghdad. American intelligence had assessed it as a command bunker. It was being used as a civilian air raid shelter. At least 400 civilians were killed, many of them women and children. It remains the single most contested strike of the entire campaign, and it is a permanent reminder that precision is a property of the weapon, not of the intelligence that aims it. An aircraft that cannot be seen and cannot be stopped hits exactly what it is told to hit. That is the whole point of it, and it is also the danger of it. For 8 years after Desert Storm, the F-117 was treated as untouchable. and then a man in Serbia, using a missile system older than the pilot he was shooting at, worked out how to do the thing that everybody said could not be done. Zoltán Dani was a lieutenant colonel in the Yugoslav Air Defense Forces, commanding the 3rd Battalion of the 250th Air Defense Missile Brigade. His equipment was, by 1999, close to museum pieces. His missile system was the S-125, known in the West as the SA-3. It entered Soviet service in 1961. His early warning radar was the P-18, a design accepted into service around 1970. Against him, NATO had the most advanced air force in history, and NATO had a problem it did not recognize. Operation Allied Force began on March 24, 1999, and within days, NATO strike aircraft began flying broadly similar routes at broadly similar times, on successive nights. The corridors were repeated. The timing was repeatable. Serbian intelligence had observers watching the NATO air bases in Italy, and those observers could report what took off and, just as importantly, what did not. If you have been paying attention, you already know what that means, because it is the exact mistake that killed B-52 crews over Hanoi in 1972. Dani did several things, and it is important to separate what is documented from what is legend, because a great deal of legend has grown up around this night. What is well supported is this. He moved his battery constantly, sometimes every few hours, dragging heavy Soviet equipment across the countryside so that it was never where NATO's targeting had last placed it. He almost entirely avoided radio. He used field telephones, buried cable and human couriers, so there was nothing to intercept. He kept his fire control radar switched off almost all of the time, and when he switched it on, he kept the transmission extremely brief. His operator that night, Sergeant Dragan Matic, has said the radar was radiating for no more than around 20 seconds. That is not long enough for a NATO anti-radiation missile to reliably home in on the source. And he used human spotters positioned along likely flight paths to tell him with a telephone call what he could not learn from the sky. He also had the P-18. And here we return to the physics, because this is where the whole story closes its circle. The F-117's shaping and its radar-absorbing materials were optimized against the short wavelength fire control radars, because those are the radars that guide missiles. Against those, the aircraft was extraordinarily quiet. But the P-18 worked at very high frequency, with waves around 2 meters long. And when the wavelength of a radar approaches the physical size of features on an aircraft, the wing edges, the tail surfaces, the fuselage sections, the scattering behavior changes fundamentally. Resonance effects appear. Careful faceting, which works beautifully against centimeter waves, does far less against a wave as long as your tail fin. A very high-frequency radar could often tell that something was out there. What it could not do was tell a missile precisely where. That is the gap. Detection is not targeting. The oldest radars in the Soviet inventory could sense the presence of a stealth aircraft and could not produce a track accurate enough to kill it. And the newest radars, the accurate ones, could produce a perfect track and could not find the aircraft in the first place. The Soviet architecture had always needed both halves of that partnership, and it had never once occurred to the men who designed it that an aircraft might come along which defeated only one of them. Zoltán Dani closed the gap by hand. He used his old long-wave radar to know roughly where to look, and he used human beings and patience to narrow it further. And then he pointed his short-wave radar at a small patch of sky for a handful of seconds, and he got what he needed. There are 2 claims about that night that circulate constantly, and that this channel is not going to state as fact. The first is that Dani had modified his radars to detect stealth aircraft. He has been quoted suggesting something like this, but Serbian sources close to the unit have said flatly that no such modification was made and that the story was propaganda. The available evidence points to disciplined tactics and old physics, not a secret technical breakthrough. The second is that the F-117's bomb bay doors were open at the exact moment of detection. This is repeated everywhere. It is entirely plausible given everything we have just discussed about what open doors do to the signature. It has also never been confirmed by anyone in a position to confirm it. Here is what is not in dispute. On the night of March 27, 1999, the 4th night of the war, there were no NATO electronic warfare aircraft supporting that particular mission. Weather over the Adriatic had grounded them. The Serbian observers watching the Italian bases had reported exactly that. Dani knew there would be no jamming. His own early warning radar failed and his crew repaired it. At around 8:20 in the evening, they found something. The aircraft was F-117 number 820806. Its call sign was Vega 31. Its pilot was Lieutenant Colonel Dale Zelko, a veteran of Desert Storm, a man who had flown into Baghdad on nights when the sky was on fire and had come home untouched. Dani's battery launched 2 missiles. One of them detonated close enough. Zelko ejected. He came down in farmland near the village of Budanovci, west of Belgrade. He hid in an irrigation ditch while Serbian search parties moved through the fields around him, and after several hours in the dark, an American combat search and rescue team took him out. He is the only man ever shot down in an F-117, and he lived. 5 weeks later, the same brigade shot down an American F-16. Its pilot, Lieutenant Colonel David Goldfein, also ejected and was also rescued, and would go on to become Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force. There are credible reports that a second F-117 was damaged by Serbian air defences around the end of April 1999, and that it never flew again. The United States Air Force has never confirmed this, and it should be treated as an open question rather than an established fact. The wreckage of Vega 31 did not stay in the field. Pieces of it were recovered and put on public display, and a section of it remains in the Aviation Museum in Belgrade to this day. Zoltán Dani kept a piece of the engine housing. Other pieces went elsewhere. According to Croatia's wartime chief of the General Staff, speaking to the BBC more than a decade later, agents from China moved through the crash area, buying components from local farmers. Russian interest has also been widely reported. Neither claim has ever been officially confirmed, and both should be treated as credible allegations rather than settled history. The F-117 kept flying over Serbia after that night, and no more were lost. But the aura was gone, and it never fully came back. The men who built the thing did not become famous. Bill Park, who took the first faceted aircraft into the air and nearly died bringing it back down, never flew a test flight again. He spent his remaining years at Lockheed on the ground and helped train the pilots who would fly the aircraft his crash had helped make possible. Ross Mulhare and Michael Stewart died in the 1980s, flying an aircraft their own families could not be told about, in accidents that could not be publicly investigated for a program whose existence was a criminal offense to discuss. Denys Overholser, the radar man who actually pulled the translated Soviet monograph off the shelf and understood what it meant, worked at Lockheed for decades and remained largely unknown outside his own profession. He died on April 28, 2026. Outside aerospace, the obituaries were brief, and Pyotr Ufimtsev, whose equations made the whole thing calculable in the first place, was still in Moscow, teaching when the F-117 flew over Baghdad. In 1990, he came to the United States. He took a position as a visiting professor of electrical engineering at the University of California, Los Angeles. He worked as a consultant to Northrop Grumman, which by then was building the B-2 stealth bomber. In 1991, he received the Leroy Randall Grumman Medal, an award from the American aerospace industry. Read that sequence again slowly. A Soviet physicist published a book. His own government reviewed it and concluded it had no significant military value. An American engineer read the translation and used it to build an aircraft that the Soviet Union's entire air defense network could not see. And then when the Soviet Union collapsed, the physicist moved to California and helped the Americans build the next one. He was never punished for it. He was never accused of anything. He had done nothing wrong. He had simply written down the truth about how radio waves behave at an edge, and his government had decided that the truth was not worth keeping. As for Zoltán Dani, he left the army in 2004 and opened a bakery in a small town in northern Serbia. In 2011, he met Dale Zelko. They had spent 12 years as the two ends of the same event. One man in a cockpit, one man at a console, neither of whom had ever seen the other's face. When they finally met, Dani cooked for him. Their families met. They became, by every account of everyone who has spent time with them since, genuine friends. Zelko has said that war is not between normal, average people. It is between the governments. He is the only pilot in history who can say that about a man who shot him down with a Soviet missile designed before either of them was born. The physics has not gone away, and neither has the argument. Russia today markets radar systems designed specifically around the lesson of 1999. The Nebo family of radars and systems like the Resonans are multi-band designs. They pair a very high frequency array which can sense that something is out there with higher frequency radars that can actually generate a firing solution, and they network the two together automatically. In other words, they are an attempt to do electronically, instantly, and at national scale, exactly what Zoltán Dani did by hand with a field telephone and a stopwatch. China fields comparable systems. Whether they work is a different question, and the last 4 years have been an unusually honest test. Since February 2022, Russian air defenses in Ukraine have been struck repeatedly and destroyed in significant numbers, including modern long-range systems. Independent open-source trackers, working only from photographic evidence, have confirmed the loss of hundreds of Russian air defense vehicles and launchers. These are the systems that were advertised for 2 decades as the answer to Western air power. In October 2024, and again during the fighting in June 2025, Israeli aircraft, including F-35 stealth fighters, struck Iranian air defense sites built around Russian designs. Iran's network did not stop them. On the night of June 21 and 22, 2025, 7 American B-2 bombers flew from Missouri to Iran and back, an 18-hour mission, and struck hardened nuclear facilities with the largest conventional penetrating bombs ever built. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dan Kane, told reporters afterwards that Iran's fighters did not fly and that its surface-to-air missile systems did not appear to see the bombers at all. Whether those strikes achieved what was claimed for them is contested. Early damage assessments varied widely, and the political claims made about the results outran the evidence, as they usually do. This channel is not going to pretend otherwise. But the tactical fact stands. Manned aircraft flew into defended airspace, and the defences did not engage them. The B-2's successor, the B-21 Raider, is flying now. 2 test aircraft are in the air at Edwards Air Force Base in California, and the first operational aircraft are expected to arrive at Ellsworth Air Force Base in South Dakota next year. Its shaping is smooth and continuous rather than faceted because the computers of the 21st century can solve for curved surfaces, which the computers of 1975 could not. But the mathematics underneath it is the same mathematics. It is Ufimtsev's. It has been the same since 1962, and it will still be the same when the B-21 is retired. And the counter to it is still, fundamentally, the same problem it was in a Serbian beat field. Detection is not targeting. Nobody has closed that gap yet. Every claim over the last 64 years that somebody has closed it has been either marketing or wishful thinking, and every time such a claim has been tested against a real stealth aircraft, the aircraft has come home. Except once. And the man who managed it did not have a better radar. He had an older one, a telephone line, an enormous amount of patience, and an opponent who flew the same route twice. That is the part that should stay with you because it has almost nothing to do with technology. There is one last thing, and almost nobody knows it. The F-117 was officially retired in 2008. It was not scrapped. The aircraft were flown back to Tonopah, the same secret airfield where they had spent their hidden years, and put into recallable storage in the same hangars, with their wings removed. They did not stay there. Since the middle of the last decade, F-117s have been photographed in the air again over Nevada and California, refueling from tankers, flying alongside modern fighters. The Air Force has quietly acknowledged that some of them are still airworthy. They are used as adversaries, as flying laboratories, and as training targets, so that American pilots and American radar operators can practice the one skill nobody has ever fully mastered: finding something that does not want to be found. The oldest stealth aircraft in the world is still flying in the dark over the same desert, teaching people how to hunt it. None of this began with an aircraft. It began with a decision. In 1962, a review committee in Moscow read a manuscript full of equations about how radio waves scatter from the edge of a surface. They found nothing in it of military or economic value. They stamped it for open publication, and it went on sale, and the greatest air defense network ever built continued to rise around them on top of an assumption that the book in their hands had already disproved. There is no espionage in this story. No stolen blueprints, no defector, no briefcase handed over in a car park. The Soviet Union published the answer, and 9 years later the United States translated it, and a few years after that, one engineer in California actually sat down and read it. That is the whole thing. That is how the sky changed. Somewhere tonight, a radar operator is watching a screen he has been trained his entire career to trust and seeing nothing at all on it. He is looking at the direct consequence of a decision made in a room nobody remembers, about a book nobody wanted. They looked at it and they decided it was worthless. They were wrong by about 30 years and one aircraft.